Well, good evening, Resonate. How you guys doing? Doing good today? Good. It is good to see you. It's crazy to think that COVID started 5 years ago. Right? Doesn't it seem like it was? Seems like it was just yesterday that we were locking up in our homes. We were doing all of our meetings and classes on Zoom. We were jumping from store to store trying to find toilet paper. You remember that? That short season. Wearing like a dryer sheets on our faces. We had to do that for a long time. It was a good time. It was a lot of fun, and I'm glad we are through it. But I remember I was thinking about COVID, thinking about that season that we went through, and I remember when COVID hit, all of the pastors all across our network, the network that Brian was just talking about, we were all scrambling to figure out what to do now, how to lead our churches, how to lead our people. So we're calling emergency meetings, we're brainstorming new strategies, anything we could think of to both protect our people and keep them connected to gospel community at the same time. And so I remember one of those meetings, everybody's so frazzled and anxious and panicked. We had this long list of problems to solve, and Keith Evans, who serves as the pastor to me and our other pastors, he stopped us at the beginning of the meeting, and he said, "Hey, I don't mean to interrupt. I know we have a lot of things to figure out, but would it be okay if we paused for a moment to pray?" And I was shocked. I was like, "Keith, we can't stop. I have things to figure out. What is my job? What am I supposed to do? How do I lead these people? I need answers to these questions." We were all going 1,000 miles an hour, and Keith broke through the noise to say, before we jump in, let's pause and talk to God. It was a good teaching moment for me. One of the things that COVID taught us is that we're not good at slowing down. We're not good at slowing down, especially to pray. So last week we started this sermon series called A Praying Life, where we are spending 4 weeks talking all about prayer. So let me recap last week. Last week was an introduction to prayer. We looked at the Lord's Prayer, given by Jesus. It's the most famous prayer in history, prayed by the most famous person in history. And from that prayer, we learned 5 things. So here's our 5 observations about prayer. Number 1, prayer starts with the understanding that God is your Father. Number 2, prayer is direct communication with God. Number 3, prayer moves God's hand. Number 4, prayer changes us. And number 5, prayer can look many different ways. So those were our foundational observations about prayer. And then once we had established what prayer is, we talked about 5 common lies that we tend to believe about prayer. So here were the 5 lies. First one, the effectiveness of my prayers is based on the quality of my prayers. That was the first lie we addressed. Number 2, God will listen to my prayers if I give more time to ministry work. Number 3, God hasn't answered my prayers. Number 4, my prayer life is unhealthy because it doesn't look like what it used to look like. And finally, number 5, I'm not even worthy to talk to God. Those are the 5 lies that we addressed last week. And so if you missed last week, you can jump on our YouTube page, you can watch that and get caught up. But with this week, with that foundation laid last week, we're going to start working through a helpful acronym that's going to be our guide for the rest of this sermon series. The acronym, coincidentally enough, is PRAY. P-R-A-Y. We should be able, we can get it right here on the screen. So it's an acronym. The first letter, P, stands for pause. This is the stillness, the silence, the solitude, the intentionality that allows us to hear God in prayer. The R stands for respond. This is the worship and the praise and the reverence that we give to God in prayer. The A stands for ask. These are the requests or the pleas or the petitions that we make of God in prayer. And then finally, Y stands for yield. This is the humble trust and faith that we give to God in prayer. P-R-A-Y. And today, we are going to talk about the pause. Hopefully you have your note sheet out in front of you. It says pause at the top, so you should know where we're going today. More than any generation before us, you and I are bad at slowing down. We are bad at slowing down. We have constant connection, constant events, constant entertainment. We have fast transportation. We listen to our podcasts on 2 times speed. We have instant answers to all of our questions on Google. Everything in the world is built to resist slowing down. Our whole world is built to resist it. There are a few specific battles that we face when it comes to slowing down. I want to walk through these. First, we face a cultural battle. Busyness is a virtue in our culture, right? Being burned out is like a badge of honor. Ever since the invention of the clock and the light bulb, humans have been sleeping less and stressing more. So we have a cultural battle in front of us. We also have a mental battle. Our attention spans are destroyed. People used to commonly sit down for 4 to 6 hours at a time just to read a book. And now we can hardly stand like a 30-second video before our thumb starts itching to swipe to the next one and the next one and the next one. Our addictions to dopamine and stimuli ramp us up and keep us from focusing on anything for too long. We also have, number 3, an emotional battle. To slow down would mean that we have to face some harsh facts about ourselves and about our lives, and we don't want to do that. So we like to keep the busyness up so that we don't have to think about it. And finally, we are facing a spiritual battle. We have an enemy who wants to keep us busy, keep us distracted, so that he can keep us from God. So we are facing cultural, mental, emotional, and spiritual forces that are trying to keep us from slowing down. But the truth is, despite those battles, we have to find a way to slow down. We must find a way to slow down. Every one of us has a limit on how much we can do and how fast we can go. Think about F1 racing, Formula One racing. These are some of the most powerful machines on earth. They go screaming around the track at 200 plus miles an hour, but even these machines can't run a whole race like that. They can't go a whole race like that. One of the most critical parts of a good F1 team is the pit stop. Right? You probably know that if you're familiar with racing. Even the very best car needs refueling and it needs new tires every so often. You and I are not that different, right? We can go fast for a while, especially when we're young and we have lots of energy, but at some point we have to slow down or else disaster strikes. You'll blow a tire, you'll lose control, you'll break down. This is the hard reality that we face. Either you slow yourself down or life is going to slow you down. Life is going to slow you down. And contrary to popular belief, binging Netflix is not slowing down. Okay? Drinking herbal tea and doing yoga and listening to a true crime podcast is not the pit stop that your soul desperately needs, even though it may feel good in the moment. God created us as spiritual beings, and we have spiritual needs. And that means that our ability to do the work that God has created us for depends on our willingness to pause and rest and be refueled by Him. Your ability to finish college with your faith intact depends on this. Your ability to sustain a healthy marriage and parent your kids depends on this. Your ability to follow Jesus until you're an old grandparent depends on this. Your whole life of faith depends on this. Just this week, the heartbreaking news came out that a legendary pastor and Bible teacher and author and conference preacher at 73 years old committed adultery and was fired. When that kind of thing happens, it's a wake-up call to all of us to slow down and examine our lives so that we can make it to the end. So we can make it to the end to go be with Jesus. So today, we're going to talk about the pause. What does it mean to push pause on the busyness of our lives to focus on prayer? And to start off, I want to get into the text that we read last week, where Jesus teaches us how to pray. There's a hidden gem in this text that we didn't really uncover last week. We're going to talk about it more today. If you have a Bible, you can open with me to Matthew chapter 6, where Jesus confronts one of the biggest temptations we have when it comes to prayer. So Jesus, Matthew chapter 6, is part of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is teaching to the crowds, he's teaching to his disciples, and he's teaching to a group of religious leaders who were curious about him. They had come out to listen to him, they were curious about him. And these religious leaders, the Pharisees, the rabbis of the day, they had a common practice where they would go to the town square, they would go out into this public town square a couple times a day and do public prayers. Okay, they would perform public prayers for everybody to hear. So here's what Jesus says, Matthew chapter 6, verse 5. It says, "And when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites." Now, again, picture the context, right? The religious leaders that he's talking about are standing right here. They're standing there amidst this whole crowd. So in a lot of ways, we could read this verse as, you must not be like these guys. Don't be like these hypocrites. Verse 5, "For they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at street corners, that they may be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward." That's the punchiness of what was happening when Jesus gave that teaching. So you and I, we may not be standing on street corners or in the town square showing off our prayer skills. I don't think many of us do that. But I know that all of us have had a moment where we want to rehearse a prayer in our head so that it sounds good to the person next to us. Right? We've all had that moment where we are engaging in public congregational prayer while our private prayer lives are non-existent. We've had those moments. And so Jesus says, don't pray like that. Instead, verse 6, but when you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. So Jesus says that prayer is not about outcomes. It's not about status or reputation or fame or receiving things. Instead, prayer is a relationship. It's about communion and intimacy with God. And therefore, since the goal of personal prayer is intimacy with God, it's not outcomes, we should develop habits of private, personal prayer to God. Private, personal prayer to God. Now, as a quick aside, does that mean we can never pray with other people? Absolutely not. That's not what Jesus is talking about. The Bible is full of examples of believers praying together. In fact, the very first thing that the early church does when they are formed in Acts chapter 1 is they devote themselves to prayer together as a church body. There are also examples in Scripture of leaders praying over their people as encouragement and instruction. And that's what happens every Sunday when I pray over us or our worship leader Ben prays over us. But there's a big difference between those things and going out in public with a megaphone to pray, trying to draw a crowd, right? You see the difference between those two things that Jesus is talking about? So that's Jesus' instruction to us. We should cultivate habits of private, personal prayer to God. But not only is this what Jesus tells us to do, it's also what he shows us to do. Jesus doesn't just talk the talk, he walks the walk. Jesus regularly pushed pause on the busyness of his life to pray. So here's 6 examples of situations where Jesus pushed pause. You can see these on your handout. Times when Jesus pushed pause. First, he pushed pause to prepare for a major task. After Jesus was baptized, he spent 40 days alone in the wilderness, praying to prepare for the temptation of Satan that was to come to him. He knew that he had a big task in front of him, and so he dedicated a huge amount of time to being alone with God. So prepare for a major task. Number 2, Jesus pushed pause to recharge after hard work. In Mark chapter 6, he sends his disciples out to minister to people all over the place. And when they come back exhausted, Jesus encourages them to get alone and pray. Get alone to rest and to pray. Number 3, Jesus pushed pause to work through grief. After he learned that his cousin John the Baptist was beheaded, Jesus went away into the wilderness to grieve by himself. Even the Son of God took time to pause and to grieve when tragedy struck. Number 4, Jesus pushed pause before making an important decision. Early in his ministry, Jesus chose the 12 men who would become his legacy, and he spent the whole night beforehand in prayer, preparing for this big decision. Number 5, Jesus pushed pause in a time of distress. Just hours before he was arrested and crucified, Jesus went up onto the Mount of Olives alone to pray. He was in great emotional agony, knowing what he was about to face, and he knew that he needed time alone with God. And number 6, Jesus pushed pause to handle increased busyness. To handle increased busyness. As the crowds grew and the demands on his time increased, Jesus made it a priority to withdraw to desolate places and pray even more. You see how as the demand increased, his personal private time in prayer also increased. It didn't decrease. The busier Jesus got, the more he prioritized the pause. Now, even a cursory reading of the life of Jesus shows that Jesus models for us what a private prayer life looks like. Jesus himself pushes pause on the responsibilities of life and ministry for the top priority, time alone with God. I want to make sure you catch that. That's the main point here. Jesus himself pushes pause on the responsibilities of life and ministry for the top priority, which is time alone with the Father. Jesus had a long to-do list. Okay, it's longer than your to-do list. It's longer than my to-do list. And still, he never forgets his deepest need. And neither should we. No matter how busy we get, we must prioritize the pause in order to be with God. When I was a little kid, growing up in the church, one of my favorite Bible stories was the story of God talking to Elijah on the mountain. Some of you might be familiar with this story. So Elijah is an Old Testament prophet, and he's running for his life at this point because the people of God, the Israelites, have become wicked and they are rebelling against God. And so here's the scene in 1 Kings chapter 19. Verse 9, we read, "There he came to a cave and he lodged in it. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, 'What are you doing here, Elijah?' Elijah said, 'I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. And he said, God said, go out and stand at the mount before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. As Elijah is frantically running for his life and desperately seeking God, God reminds him that he meets us not in the loud and flashy and terrifying, but in the quiet. There's a commentary on this passage where Tony Merida says, God often appears not in the spectacular, but in the gentle whisper. Let's remember that God often works in quiet ways. Sometimes the fire does fall in corporate gatherings, but God also works quietly through his written word and through his Spirit in the hearts of his people. Don't always seek controversy and drama or major conferences. Seek the God of grace in the quiet place. Get alone with him and listen to his word. Our lives are so full of action and responsibility and hobbies that it can be difficult to even find time to seek God. But for many of us, even when we find time to seek God, we are seeking him in places that we shouldn't. Right? We're looking for him in the latest church drama or our newest theological insight or the most emotional worship song on Spotify. And the story of Elijah reminds us that God has invited us to meet him, not in the wind and the earthquake and the fire, but in the quiet, in the still, small voice. And so what is this all building toward? What's the main idea that we are getting at here? Here's how I would summarize it. I threw in a little bit of alliteration just as a gift to you guys. Here's my summary. Main point. In order to cultivate a healthy prayer life, we must have a predictable pattern of pushing pause on the distractions of our lives. We must have a predictable pattern of pushing pause on the distractions of our lives. Now, I want to be really clear. I'm encouraging you toward a predictable pattern of pushing pause, not a permanent pause. Okay? If all you do is pause, then you're no different from the monk in the monastery who has believed the secular sacred lie that we talked about last week. God designed you to work, to have jobs, to have families, to have responsibilities, to be engaged in ministry, and a life of only pausing is not an obedient life. God has designed you for work to happen. But I would guess that almost all of us fall into the opposite ditch. We're not in the permanent pause ditch. We fall into the opposite ditch. Our lives are so full of responsibilities and distractions and busyness that we almost never push pause. We almost never push pause. But in order to cultivate a healthy prayer life, we must have a predictable pattern of pushing pause on the distractions in our lives. That's the main point today. And so if that's true, if that main point is true, then what does it mean for a Christian to pause? Let's define that word pause. I think Psalm 46 gives us a really simple and a really helpful guide. Psalm 46, verse 10 says, "Be still and know that I am God." Be still and know that I am God. Really simple. There's two parts to the pause. There's a practical component and there's a spiritual component. So first, be still. That's the practical component. And then know that I am God is the spiritual component. Let's talk about each of those components for a minute. To be still means to slow down, to find quiet, to eliminate distractions. It doesn't just mean slow down your body, it means slow down your mind, slow down your thoughts, slow down your heart rate. There's a modern worship song out there called Here Now, which, to be honest with you, I don't actually care for the song as a whole, but there's one line in that song that I really do like, and it's become part of my private prayer life. So the line is, "Still my heart, let your voice be all I hear now." Still my heart, let your voice be all I hear now. I pray that prayer almost every day at some point. At some point in my day, when I'm rushed, when I'm frustrated, anxious, hurried, distracted, I ask God to still my heart and to let his voice be the only thing I hear now. I pray that every day as I stand over there getting ready to preach. Still my heart, let your voice be all I hear now. So to be still is to withdraw from the busyness and the distractions of our world and to focus our attention on God. Be still. And the second part of the pause is to know that I am God. Now, this is the spiritual or the mental component. It means that we must remember and remind ourselves of the God that we serve. In our busy lives, it can be easy to forget or to lose track of who God is. We gradually, subconsciously begin rebuilding him in our own image instead of believing who he says he is. And so in these moments of pause, we have to remind ourselves of who God is. Specifically, Psalm 46, the psalmist says that we should remember two things about God: his power and his grace. His power and his grace. Our God is powerful. In fact, he's all-powerful. He can do all things. He is sovereign over all things. He governs all things. No one can raise a hand against him. No one can thwart his purposes. No one can challenge his character. He is supreme. He is holy. He is eternal. God is not the most powerful thing in creation. God is outside of creation entirely. He is above and beyond and transcendent over everything that exists. And that same powerful God is also infinitely gracious to us. He is our refuge. He's our comforter. He's our hiding place. He sees us in our sin and our brokenness, and he has provided a way out for us. So just think about that. The sovereign, all-powerful, infinitely worthy God of the universe saw us committing treason against him, and instead of squashing us like a bug, which he had every right to do, he chose to enter into human history and redeem us through his Son. God sent his only Son to earth to take all of our sin on his shoulders and to pay the punishment in full. And on that cross, Jesus bore the physical agony of a crucifixion, but he also bore the spiritual agony of eternal punishment, all concentrated into one moment. That's what Jesus bore on the cross. And he did all of this so that sinful rebels like you and I could be adopted into the family of a God, the same God that we were in rebellion against. If you put your faith in Jesus, all your sins have been paid for, and all of his righteousness has been given to you. The ultimate grace displayed by the ultimate power. That's the God that we serve. And when we pause, that's the God that we need to remember. So 2 parts: be still, get away, get alone, unplug, disconnect, slow down, and then know that I am God. Remember the grace and the power of the one that you serve. That's what it means to pause. Be still and know that I am God. On January 27th of 1956, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was sitting at his kitchen table in the middle of the night, contemplating what he was going to do with his life. He had just arrived in Montgomery, Alabama to lead the bus boycott following Rosa Parks' courageous actions. And the civil rights movement was picking up steam, and King was quickly becoming the figurehead for the movement. But that also meant that he had begun to receive death threats and mistreatment everywhere he went. He was afraid both for his life and for the lives of his wife and his daughter. And so he's sitting at his kitchen table, unable to sleep, unable to quiet his mind, unable to get some rest, and he decides to pray. He decides to pause and to pray. Here's how he described it in a sermon later. He said, "I bowed down over that cup of coffee. I'll never forget it. I prayed out loud that night. I said, Lord, I'm down here trying to do what's right, but Lord, I must confess that I'm weak now. I'm faltering. I'm losing my courage. And it seemed at that moment that I could hear an inner voice saying to me, Martin Luther, stand up for righteousness. Stand up for justice. Stand up for truth. And lo, I will be with you even until the end of the world." He said, almost at once, my fears began to go. My uncertainty disappeared. What would our world look like today if Martin Luther didn't take a moment to pause in his kitchen that night? To still his body and his heart, to remember that he serves a God of righteousness and justice. What would our country look like if he didn't take that moment to pause? In order to cultivate a healthy prayer life, we must have predictable patterns of pushing pause on the distractions of our lives. And so, as I move toward an application here, what could that look like for us? What could those predictable patterns look like practically so that we can have time with God, personal, private prayer time with God? I want to encourage you today to build into your life 3 rhythms. Okay, these are going to be practical, realistic rhythms that we can all build into our lives. Daily, weekly, and annual. A daily rhythm, a weekly rhythm, and an annual rhythm. I don't know who I got this from. I got this years ago. It's been helpful to me for years, but this didn't come from me originally. If you think, wow, Preston's really smart, I just read it somewhere. Predictable patterns of pushing pause. So 3 rhythms I want to encourage you toward. Number 1 is a daily diversion. A daily diversion. This is a daily habit of short pausing to spend a moment with God. To spend a moment with God. Depending on your stage of life, this could look totally different. If you have quite a bit of free time and availability, this might look like a slow hour in the morning where you get to spend time with God, or you get to go on an evening walk in your neighborhood. If you have less time, if you have little kids at home or you have a demanding full-time job or something, this might look like 15 minutes in your car during your lunch break. It might look like a 10-minute shower during nap time. The key for this pattern is that it must be realistic. If you set unrealistic expectations for yourself, you're going to wind up frustrated and discouraged and unlikely to try it again. So set small, realistic expectations for this daily diversion. And during this time, here's what you should do. Take a moment to thank God for what He's given you, tell Him what's on your mind, and then listen to see if anything becomes clear. So it doesn't have to be complicated. Say thank you for what you've given me, tell Him what's on your mind, and listen to see if anything becomes clear. That can take 30 seconds, or it can take 2 hours, whatever you have in your life. So a daily diversion. Number 2, I want to encourage you toward a weekly withdrawal. This is a weekly habit of longer pausing to enjoy God's gifts and to listen to Him. To enjoy His gifts and listen to Him. You might have a pretty consistent schedule that allows you to do this on the same day, same time every week. You might have a more flexible schedule, and you have to let this pattern flex a little bit. That's how my schedule is. I have to flex a little bit. But either way, your goal in this time is to just enjoy what God has given you. Okay, so this doesn't have to be like 3 hours in a closet by yourself. That's not what I'm talking about here. This could be doing something you love, like going on a hike or reading a novel or doing a hobby that you have. You can do it by yourself, or you can do it with people that you enjoy, like your friends or your family. For me, I often find time on Thursday or Friday to do some yard work or some landscaping or something with my hands, because my job is mostly mental and verbal. So I'll find something to do with my hands while listening to a fiction book. That's what I love to do. And then I have some family time in the evening. That's my weekly withdrawal, usually on a Thursday or Friday. And the whole time I'm thanking God for what He's given me. God, thank you for this garden. Thank you for my wife and my daughters. Thank you for all these things that you've given me. The key for this pattern is that you have to break your routine. Okay, so when I say withdrawal, I don't mean withdrawal from the world. Don't withdraw from your family. Don't withdraw from your life entirely. I mean withdrawal from the routine, from the typical routine you find yourself in. So don't let the usual distractions butt in. That might mean you turn off your phone, turn off social media, no work, things like that. Set this time apart to enjoy God and enjoy His gifts, just for a little while every week. And finally, an annual pattern would be an annual abandonment. Annual abandonment. This is an annual habit of extended pausing to reflect on the year and disconnect from the normal routine. Again, depending on your life stage, this might look really different. It could be a vacation with family or friends. It could be a retreat to a cabin with no cell service. It could be a solo backpacking trip. I've done all 3 of those things over the years. They've all been great. But it really helps if you can get out of town for this kind of a pattern. Get out of town, break your normal rhythm, because that will naturally get you kind of out of those routines. It also helps if you can disconnect from your digital connectivity, like social media and texting and calls and things like that. The purpose of this time is to escape from the normal responsibilities that occupy our days. You can use this time to rest and recharge, but you can also use it to review your year and plan this next year. So think about your year. How did it go? How did I grow? What did I accomplish? Who am I becoming? What do I want to do in this next year? Those are good questions to ask during an annual abandonment. So 3 patterns: daily diversion, weekly withdrawal, and annual abandonment. A quick note, I want to make sure you all hear me say this clearly. These 3 patterns are encouragements from me, not a command from God. Okay, this is not in the Bible. You're not going to find anything like this in the Bible. This is just simply a joyful encouragement from me as your pastor, because I care about you. So if you hear this and you think, I don't want to do a weekly withdrawal, I want to do a monthly withdrawal, that's fine. You can do whatever you want. Nobody's making you do anything. What the principle that we should all abide by is that a healthy prayer life requires a predictable pattern of pushing pause. So build those patterns into your life. One other this is potentially exciting for some of you, thing that I want to share with you. In the last year, the Resonate Network, again, the network that Brian was talking about during the announcements, has purchased a retreat center in Hagen, Montana, which is about 15 minutes from Lookout Pass. It's about an hour west of Missoula. That retreat center is available to owners, to members of Resonate Church, anytime there's not a pre-scheduled event going on. So that means that if a group of friends or a huddle or a village want to go up to Hagen for a weekend, for hiking, just to unplug, to go skiing, whatever you want to do, we can make that happen for you. Reach out to a village leader. We can definitely make that happen. We want to encourage you all in rhythms of pausing that keeps you connected to God and connected to His mission. So our church wants to serve you in that way. So please reach out if that retreat center can be helpful to you. So as I close our time today, I want to do maybe the most awkward thing you've ever done at church. Okay? Some of you just got really nervous. Most awkward thing you've ever done. We're going to practice the pause for 5 minutes together. Okay? 5 minutes together. Right here in this room, we're going to spend 5 minutes slowing down, stilling our hearts, remembering who God is. So this is not Buddhist mindfulness. We're not channeling an energy. We're not aligning our chakras. We're not communing with a nameless, faceless force out there. We are quieting our hearts so that we can speak to and listen to a personal God who loves us and knows us. So here's my instruction for you. You got to listen to these instructions so you know what we're doing. Number one, silence distractions. So silence your phone, turn off your phone, put it in your purse, put it in your back pocket, whatever you got to do. Silence distractions. We're not going to play any background music. I'm even going to have Ben turn the lights off here in a couple minutes. So we're going to try to limit all of the distractions we can. Number two, find a space. So you can bow in your seats. You can kneel on the floor in front of you. You can move around this room. This whole room is yours, so do whatever you want with it. Find a space in this room. And then when the time starts, here's a couple things I want to encourage you to do. First, spend a minute or two thanking God for things in your life. Just a minute or two, thank you for a couple things that God has given you. After that, what you're going to notice is that your mind starts to wander. Okay? Your thoughts are going to get off track. You're going to start thinking about an upcoming test or a conflict with a friend or a date that you're nervous about or a problem at home. That's okay. Whatever comes up in your mind, tell God about it. Okay? Whatever your mind wanders to, tell God about it. You don't have to solve it. You don't even have to know what you're asking for. Just tell God about it as if He is a Father who cares for you because He is. Tell Him what you're experiencing. Tell Him what you're feeling. Tell Him what you want. That's going to be the entire 5 minutes. After those 5 minutes, I'm going to bring us back together in prayer, and then we have a couple discussion questions just like we usually do. So Ben, if you would turn these house lights off, I'm going to start a 5-minute timer, and let's just spend a little bit of time, private, pause with God.